Charles Ponzi was the man who started it all. In the 1920s, Ponzi promised investors a whopping 50% return in 45 days, or 100% in 90 days. He earned $15 million and became a millionaire in only 6 months. When Ponzi was caught 1 year later, investors received a mere $5 million back. He was charged with 86 counts of mail fraud and sentenced to 5 years. During his time in federal prison, he was prosecuted again in Massachusetts, but Ponzi claimed double jeopardy and his case went to the Supreme Court. He was then sentenced to 7 to 9 years in state prison. Ultimately he died penniless in Brazil, working as a translator. Lou Pearlman was one of the hottest music producers in the 90s, having worked with NSYNC, LFO, and the Backstreet Boys. In addition to producing music, he also produced one of the biggest and longest-running Ponzi schemes in U.S. history, having stolen more than $300 million. For over 20 years, Pearlman convinced individuals and corporations to invest in 2 companies that only existed on paper. He also created fake financial statements to secure bank loans. In 2008, Pearlman was convicted of money laundering, conspiracy and making false statements during a bankruptcy proceeding. Michael Eugene Kelly ran a massive Ponzi scheme, defrauding nearly 8,000 investors, mostly retired or elderly people out of about $500 million. This was not a traditional Ponzi scheme because most Ponzi schemes leave nothing left to return to its victims, whereas Kelly had millions of dollars of real estate and other assets. Kelly's scheme consisted of creating universal leases which paid high commissions to brokers who sold what were basically timeshare investments. Investors could stay in the hotel rooms for 1 week a year or use another company, which was not surprisingly owned by Kelly, to lease the rooms at an annual return rate of 11%. Kelly remained in federal custody from 2006 to 2012. When someone runs a church, it's safe to say that this person is a man of God, but sometimes that God is the almighty dollar. In the mid-1990s, Pastor Gerald Payne ran Greater Ministries International, where his greatest accomplishment was bilking 18,000 people out of approximately $20 million. How did he get these devoted churchgoers to hand over their cash? Well, it wasn't through passing around a basket. Using scripture, he told the members of the church that if they invested with him and the church, they could double their money. Payne got away with his scheme for a while by cashing checks written for under the $10,000 reporting limit, but ultimately, the IRS caught on and traced it back to Payne and his wife's checking account. Payne claimed the cash wasn't invested, but gifted, and that their First Amendment rights as a church were violated. Payne was sentenced to 27 years in prison and his wife, Betty, was sentenced to just less than 13 years. Scott Rothstein is currently serving a 50-year prison sentence, for a $1.4 billion Ponzi scheme. The largest Ponzi scheme in the history of Florida, the now disbarred lawyer Rothstein lived a very flashy lifestyle, owning over 200 luxury watches, Bugattis and other cars, as well as doing his business on his very own golden toilet. Rothstein convinced investors to purchase fabricated structured settlements. Investors were guaranteed a return of at least 20% in 3 months. On January 27, 2010, he pleaded guilty to 5 federal crimes. During the investigation, his wife, Kim, tried to hide jewelry and other assets, but she too was found, and was forced to serve 1.5 years in prison. Gary Gauthier hosted a radio show called It's God's Money in Tampa. It probably wasn't God's intention to have him steal $6 million from 38 senior citizens in Pinellas, Pasco, and Hillsborough counties. He promised his victims an 8% to 40% return on investments in real estate. Gauthier lured his victims by telling listeners to call him, and he would set up a personal meeting at their homes or at his office. The scheme lasted from 2005 to 2010. To increase his legitimacy, investors, who presumably received a return, would call into the radio show and talk about how they got rich quick. Ultimately, Gauthier was charged with a laundry list of charges, from racketeering to security fraud. In 1984, South African entrepreneur, Adrian Newow decided to market a beauty product based on an ingredient found in his grandmother's milk-based cultures, known as kubus. Newow sold off-dried plant activator kits to investors, so they could grow the milk cultures themselves in a work-at-home type scheme. They'd sell the grown cultures back to the company and in turn, would be used as an ingredient for this beauty product that didn't actually exist. Didn't anyone wonder why the company didn't just grow the culture themselves, instead of selling the kits? Furthermore, this entire operation sounds unsanitary. While the scheme sounds sort of legitimate, the problem was that only 1 unit per week would be bought back, regardless of how many activator kits were purchased. Newow was finally stopped when the operation was declared an illegal lottery by the South African government. Tom Peters ran a $3.65 billion Ponzi scheme, where investors funded non-existent electronic goods, to sell to big box retailers who weren't buying them. Peters owned many well-known large companies, including Fingerhut and Polaroid, which made him appear trustworthy in the eyes of investors. On December 2, 2009, Peters was charged with 20 counts of fraud, including money laundering, wire fraud and mail fraud. He is currently serving a 50-year prison sentence in a federal facility in Leavenworth, Kansas. Peters was the largest fraudator the state of Minnesota had ever seen. Reed Slatkin was the co-founder of technology company Earthlink and a Scientology minister. Beginning in 1986, Slatkin ran a Ponzi scheme for 15 years, through an unlicensed investment club, where he promised a 24% return. He stole $592 million from nearly 800 people, guilty of 15 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Many of Slatkin's victims were also Scientologists and includes news anchor, Greta Van Susteren and Pearl Harbor producer, Armyan Bernstein. Slatkin served his sentence and was released from a halfway house, in July 2013. Bernie Madoff is presumably the most famous Ponzi scheme, other than Ponzi himself, operating the largest fraud in U.S. history. Madoff stole $65 billion from investors and committed over 11 federal felonies. Madoff lived a flashy, luxurious life by most standards, but less so than, for example, Scott Rothstein. Madoff received the maximum sentence of 150 years in prison, which he is currently serving in Raleigh, North Carolina.